Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The Endless Forest. It started as a weekend getaway. Ethan, Sarah, and Mark had planned a camping trip deep in the woods, far from the city's noise and the demands of their everyday lives. They packed light, just the essentials, determined to rough it for a few days. The forest was dense, untouched, and eerily silent, except for the occasional rustling of unseen creatures in the underbrush. The first day went smoothly. They set up their tents by a small creek, roasted marshmallows over a fire, and laughed about old times. But as the night fell, something changed. The woods grew too quiet. The wind had stopped. The usual nocturnal sounds, crickets, distant hoots of owls, rustling leaves had vanished. The silence pressed in on them like a physical weight, making every breath feel unnatural. Then came the whispers, low, indistinct, like 1,000 voices speaking at once just beyond the edge of the light. Mark was the first to mention it. "You guys hear that?" Sarah nodded, her eyes wide. "It sounds like people, but I can't make out what they're saying." Ethan turned toward the darkness, shining his flashlight. The beam stretched out, illuminating nothing but trees, yet the feeling remained. Something was watching. "Just the wind," Ethan muttered, though he didn't believe it. He threw another log onto the fire, and the flames crackled to life, pushing back the shadows. They stayed close that night, huddled near the fire, and eventually drifted into an uneasy sleep. By morning, Sarah was gone. Her tent was unzipped, her sleeping bag pushed aside as if she had simply stepped out in the night. No footprints led away from the campsite, no sign of a struggle. Panic set in quickly. They called her phone, no signal. They searched in every direction, shouting her name. But the deeper they went into the woods, the more the trees seemed to stretch impossibly tall, their branches weaving together overhead, blocking out the sky. The forest had changed. The creek they had camped beside was gone. In its place was a dry, cracked riverbed. "We need to go back," Mark said, gripping Ethan's arm. "Something isn't right. We'll find help." Ethan nodded, and they retraced their steps, or tried to. The path back to the car had vanished. The forest had swallowed it whole. They walked in what should have been the right direction for hours, but it only led them deeper into the trees. Their footprints disappeared behind them as soon as they moved forward, as if the forest was erasing their presence. Then, as the sun began to set, the whispering returned, closer this time, louder. Mark spun around, his face pale. "It's Sarah," he whispered. "I hear her." Ethan listened hard, and sure enough, her voice rose among the whispers. "Help me. Please, help me." It was coming from the trees ahead. Mark took off running before Ethan could stop him, disappearing into the thicket. His voice joined the whispers within seconds. Ethan was alone. Darkness fell quickly. The trees felt closer, the space between them suffocating. Shapes moved just beyond his vision, too fast to catch, too real to ignore. His flashlight flickered, and when it came back, he saw something standing between the trees. It looked like Sarah. Her back was to him, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Sarah," he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't move. Then, with slow, jerky movements, her head turned. Not her body, just her head, twisting around, inch by inch, until her hollow black eyes met his. Ethan ran. He didn't stop until his legs gave out, and even then he crawled. The whispering never ceased. It followed him, wrapped around him, until it was inside his head, and then he understood. There was no escape. The forest had no end, and neither did he. The shadows beneath Blackwood in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, where the trees grew dense and the valleys were shrouded in perpetual mist, there lay a small, isolated town called Blackwood. The town was old, its roots stretching back to the early days of American settlement, and it was a place where time seemed to stand still. The people of Blackwood were a superstitious lot, their lives governed by traditions and rituals that had been passed down through generations. They spoke in hushed tones of the forest that surrounded the town, of the shadows that moved within it, and of the ancient evil that slept beneath the earth. The forest was a place of mystery and danger, a place where the rules of the natural world did not apply. The trees grew tall and twisted, their branches forming a canopy, so thick that sunlight rarely reached the forest floor. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and decay, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant cries of unseen creatures. The people of Blackwood avoided the forest, venturing into it only when absolutely necessary, and even then, they did so with great caution. But for all their fear, the people of Blackwood knew that the forest was not the true source of their unease. That honor belonged to the mine, the Blackwood mine, a sprawling network of tunnels that stretched deep into the earth. The mine had been the lifeblood of the town for generations, providing coal and other minerals that kept the economy afloat. But it had also been the site of countless tragedies, cave-ins, gas explosions, and mysterious disappearances that were never explained. The mine had been closed for decades, its entrance sealed with heavy steel doors and marked with warning signs, but the people of Blackwood still felt its presence, a dark, oppressive force that seemed to seep up from the ground and into their lives. They spoke of strange occurrences, of hearing the sound of pickaxes striking stone in the dead of night, of seeing shadowy figures moving in the depths of the forest, of feeling an unshakable sense of dread whenever they passed by the mine. It was into this atmosphere of fear and superstition that Daniel Carter arrived. He was a geologist, a man of science, and he had come to Blackwood to study the mine and the strange geological formations that surrounded it. He had read about the mine in an old journal, a dusty tome filled with cryptic references to the shadows beneath the earth. Intrigued, he had decided to investigate, convinced that the stories were nothing more than folklore, and that the mine was simply an abandoned relic of a bygone era. Daniel arrived in Blackwood on a cold, gray afternoon, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain. The townsfolk eyed him warily as he passed through the streets, his suitcase in hand and a notebook tucked under his arm. When he asked for directions to the mine, they shook their heads and muttered under their breath, refusing to meet his gaze. Finally, an old man pointed him in the right direction, his gnarled hand trembling as he spoke. "Don't go there," he warned, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not a place for the living." Daniel thanked him and set off, dismissing his words as the superstitious ramblings of an old man. The path to the mine was overgrown and treacherous, the ground uneven and slick with mud. The forest stretched out on either side of him, the trees pressing closer and closer as he walked. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and he felt a sense of unease settle over him. When he reached the mine, he paused for a moment, taking in its imposing silhouette. The entrance was a gaping maw in the side of the mountain, the steel doors rusted and covered in vines. The warning signs were faded and barely legible, their messages of danger long since ignored. Daniel pushed the doors open, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, and something else, something metallic and sharp. He switched on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness as he descended into the mine. The walls were lined with old wooden supports, their surfaces blackened with soot and age. The floor was littered with debris, broken tools, discarded helmets, and the remnants of old mining carts. As he explored, he began to notice strange things, a faint rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere deep within the tunnels, the sound of footsteps on the stone floor behind him, the feeling of being watched. He told himself it was just the wind, or the settling of the old mine, but the unease in his chest grew with every passing moment. That night, Daniel decided to stay in the mine. He had brought a sleeping bag and a lantern, and he set up camp in one of the larger chambers, the darkness pressing in around him. As he lay there, the sound of the tapping grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the tunnels, a steady rhythmic sound that seemed to echo in his bones. He sat up, his heart pounding, and shone his flashlight into the tunnels. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just the empty tracks stretching into the void. The tapping continued, growing louder and more frantic, and he realized it was coming from all around him, from the walls themselves. He stood, his hands trembling, and began to pack up his things. He needed to leave, to get whispers in the walls. Lena bought the house because it was a steal, a gorgeous Victorian, 3 stories high with stained glass windows and a wraparound porch. It needed work, sure, but she was willing to put in the effort. She didn't mind the history, even if that history included the previous owner vanishing without a trace. The first night was quiet, aside from the normal creaks of an old house settling. The second night she started hearing it, the whispering. At first she thought it was the wind slipping through cracks in the walls, but as she lay in bed it became clearer. Voices, faint, urgent, like someone murmuring just beneath her floorboards. Lena sat up, heart pounding. She strained to listen, her ears buzzing with the effort. The voices were too low to make out the words, but the tone was desperate, pleading. She grabbed a flashlight and padded barefoot down the hall, following the whispers. They led her to the living room, where the air was thick, heavy with something unseen. The hairs on her arms stood up. The whispering stopped. Then came a new sound, a single knock from inside the wall. Lena froze, then another knock. Louder, more insistent. It was coming from the far corner, near the old fireplace. She hesitated before stepping closer, pressing her palm against the wallpaper. It was warm, almost feverish. The knock came again, and this time a voice followed. "Help me." Lena yanked her hand back. The voice was muffled but clear, a woman's voice. She stumbled back, grabbing her phone, ready to call the police. But as soon as she turned on the screen, the whispering flooded back, surrounding her like a tide of hushed voices. "Don't call, don't call, don't call." Her fingers hovered over the keypad, but something inside her told her to listen. The whispering wasn't hostile, it was warning her. She swallowed hard, lowering the phone. The air shifted, the house groaned, its wooden bones stretching. Then the knock came again. A scraping sound followed. Someone was moving inside the wall. Lena's stomach twisted. She had to see what was in there. With shaking hands, she grabbed a hammer from the toolbox by the stairs. Each step toward the fireplace felt heavier, like the house itself was resisting. But she ignored the dread creeping up her spine and raised the hammer. The first strike shattered the old plaster. Dust filled the air, coating her tongue with the taste of decay. She coughed and swung again, revealing layers of rotting wood beneath. Then she saw it, a hand, shriveled, skeletal, its fingers curled inward as if frozen in a final desperate grasp. Lena stumbled back, her breath hitching. The hand was attached to an arm, and the arm to a body mummified and crumbling within the walls. And then the whispering stopped. A breath of silence filled the house, and in that silence something else moved behind her. The forgotten station beneath the bustling streets of London, where the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the echoes of footsteps faded into the distance. There lay a forgotten place. It was a subway station, long abandoned and sealed off from the world above. The maps had erased its name, the city had forgotten its existence, and the trains no longer stopped at its crumbling platform. But for those who knew where to look, the entrance to Blackthorn Station still remained, a rusted gate hidden in the shadows of an alleyway, its lock long since broken. The station had been closed in the 1940s, after a series of unexplained disappearances. Passengers had vanished without a trace, their screams echoing through the tunnels before being swallowed by the darkness. The authorities had investigated, but no bodies were ever found, no evidence uncovered. The station was deemed cursed, and the decision was made to seal it off, to let the darkness claim it. But the darkness had a way of calling to those who were lost, those who were searching for something they couldn't name. And so, over the years, a handful of curious souls had found their way to Blackthorn Station, drawn by whispers and rumors. Most never returned. Those who did were never the same. It was into this forgotten place that Clara Bennett stumbled one cold, rainy night. She was a photographer, always searching for the next story, the next hidden corner of the world to capture through her lens. She had heard about Blackthorn Station from an old man in a pub, his voice trembling as he spoke of the horrors that lay beneath the city. Intrigued, she had decided to investigate. Convinced that the stories were nothing more than urban legends, she found the gate easily enough, its rusted hinges groaning as she pushed it open. The stairs leading down were slick with moisture, the air growing colder with every step. She switched on her flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness as she descended into the station. The platform was exactly as she had imagined it, crumbling and decayed, the tiles cracked and stained with age. The walls were covered in graffiti, the names and dates of those who had come before her scrawled in shaky handwriting. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something metallic and sharp. Clara raised her camera and began to take pictures, the flash illuminating the platform in brief, blinding bursts. She moved slowly, her footsteps echoing in the silence, her breath visible in the cold air. As she explored, she began to notice strange things, a faint rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere deep within the tunnels, the sound of footsteps on the platform behind her, the feeling of being watched. She told herself it was just the wind or the settling of the old station, but the unease in her chest grew with every passing moment. That night, Clara decided to stay in the station. She had brought a sleeping bag and a thermos of coffee, and she set up camp on the platform, the darkness pressing in around her. As she lay there, the sound of the tapping grew louder. more insistent. It was coming from the tunnels, a steady rhythmic sound that seemed to echo in her bones. She sat up, her heart pounding, and shone her flashlight into the tunnels. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the empty tracks stretching into the void. The tapping continued, growing louder and more frantic, and she realized it was coming from all around her, from the walls themselves. She stood, her hands trembling, and began to pack up her things. She needed to leave, to get out of the station before whatever was making that sound found her. But as she turned to go, she heard it. The whispers, they were faint at first, barely audible, but they grew louder. As she stood there frozen in place, the words were indistinct, a jumble of voices speaking over one another, but there was an urgency to them, a desperation that sent a chill down her spine. Clara ran, her footsteps echoing on the platform as she made her way back to the stair. The whispers followed her, growing louder and more. She stinned, and she realized they were coming from the walls, from the very air around her. She reached the stairs and began to climb, her heart pounding in her chest, the whispers growing louder with every step. But as she reached the top, she realized something was wrong. The gate was gone, replaced by a solid wall of stone. She pounded on it, her hands raw and bleeding, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and she felt a presence behind her. She turned slowly, her heart pounding, and saw it, a figure, tall and thin, its form shifting and twisting as though it were made of smoke. Its face was a featureless void, its eyes glowing with a cold, malevolent light. It reached out a hand and Clara felt a cold, numbing sensation spread through her body. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and she realized they were coming from the figure. It spoke, its voice, a cacophony of voices, each one filled with pain and despair. "You should not have come here," it said, its voice echoing in the small space. Clara tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure drew closer, its form shifting and twisting, and she felt her consciousness slipping away. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was the figure's face, a void, empty and endless, filled with the whispers of countless voices. When she woke, she was back on the platform, her camera still in her. The station was silent, the whispers gone. For a moment, she thought it had all been a dream, but then she noticed the dirt on her hands and the smell of smoke in her hair. She looked in the viewfinder of her camera and saw that the pictures she had taken were all blank, the film exposed but empty. The whispers were still there, faint but persistent, a constant reminder of what had happened. Clara never left Blackthorn Station. She tried, but every time she reached the stairs, she found herself back on the platform, as though the station were refusing to let her go. The whispers followed her wherever she went, growing louder and more insistent with each passing day. Eventually, she stopped trying to leave. She became just like the station, silent, lifeless, and filled with shadows. She would sit on the platform staring into the tunnels, listening to the whispers that never stopped, and sometimes late at night, she would hear a knock at the gate. When she opened it, there would be no one there, just the sound of the wind, and the faint, distant whispers of the figure, calling her name. The hollow guest. It started with the knocks, 3 sharp raps on the front door at exactly 3:03 a.m. Peter woke up instantly, his heart pounding against his ribs. He lived alone. His nearest neighbor was a mile down the road, and he hadn't ordered anything, nor was he expecting visitors. He stayed in bed, gripping the covers, listening. Silence. Then 3 more knocks. Same rhythm, same intensity. He swallowed hard. It was just the wind, he told himself. Just some animal brushing against the door. But his gut told him otherwise. He reached for his phone. No service. Typical. The storm earlier that night must have knocked the tower out again. Peter sighed, forcing himself up. If someone really needed help, he couldn't ignore them. He crept to the front door, the wooden floor creaking beneath his bare feet. Through the peephole there was nothing but darkness. The porch light flickered, casting sickly yellow glows that barely reached the trees lining his driveway. He hesitated before unlocking the door. His fingers trembled as he turned the knob and pulled it open an inch. The night was cold, still, and empty. Nobody was there. Peter exhaled, shaking his head at himself. Probably just his nerves. He closed the door, locking it again, and turned back toward his room. 3 knocks. This time they came from inside the house. Peter spun around, every hair on his body standing up. The door was still shut, locked. The sound had come from deeper within the house. The kitchen. He grabbed the fireplace poker from the rack and crept forward. The kitchen was bathed in eerie moonlight, silver beams slanting through the windows. The air was thick, heavy. He strained his ears, listening. A faint creak came from behind him. He turned, swinging the poker blindly. Nothing. The house groaned as if it were breathing. Peter's own breath came in ragged gasps. He wasn't alone. He could feel it, an unseen presence shifting, watching. His phone buzzed suddenly, making him jump. A text message, a number he didn't recognize. "Let me in." Peter's hands shook as he stared at the screen. Another message arrived. "I'm already inside." His pulse roared in his ears. He raised his head, scanning the darkened corners of the room. His reflection in the window stared back at him, wide-eyed and terrified. Then it blinked. He didn't. The reflection's mouth twisted into a grin, one that didn't belong to him. Peter stumbled backward, but his feet wouldn't move. His body felt sluggish, as if something was pulling him down, rooting him to the spot. The reflection stepped forward, pressing a hand against the glass from the inside. A hollow whisper filled the room. "You opened the door." Peter tried to scream, but darkness swallowed him before he could make a sound. The house at the edge of the moor on the outskirts of the small village of Greywick, where the cobblestone streets gave way to rolling hills and the hills to the desolate expanse of Blackthorn Moor, there stood a house. It was an old, crumbling structure, its stone walls blackened by time and weather, its windows dark and lifeless. The villagers called it Moorcroft House, and they avoided it as though it were cursed. Stories had been passed down for generations about the house. Whispers of strange lights in the windows, of screams echoing across the moor, of people who had gone in and never come out. No one knew who had built the house, or who owned it now. It had stood empty for as long as anyone could remember, a silent sentinel at the edge of the moor, but every now and then, someone would claim to have seen movement in the windows, or heard the sound of footsteps on the creaking wooden floors. The villagers dismissed these stories as the ramblings of drunkards or the overactive imaginations of children, but deep down they all felt it, the unease that settled over them whenever they looked toward the house, the sense that something was watching them from the shadows. It was into this atmosphere of fear and superstition that Thomas Hargrave arrived. He was a historian, a man of reason and logic, and he had come to Greywick to research the history of Moorcroft House. He had read about it in an old journal, a dusty tome filled with cryptic references to the house and its dark secrets. Intrigued, he had decided to investigate, convinced that the stories were nothing more than folklore and that the house was simply an abandoned relic of a bygone era. Thomas arrived in Greywick on a cold, gray afternoon, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain. The villagers eyed him warily as he passed through the streets, his suitcase in hand and a notebook tucked under his arm. When he asked for directions to Moorcroft House, they shook their heads and muttered under their breath, refusing to meet his gaze. Finally, an old woman pointed him in the right direction, her gnarled hand trembling as she spoke. "Don't go there," she warned, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not a place for the living." Thomas thanked her and set off, dismissing her words as the superstitious ramblings of an old woman. The path to the house was overgrown and treacherous, the ground uneven and slick with mud hanging in its imposing silhouette. It was larger than he had expected, its stone walls looming over him like a predator ready to pounce. The windows were dark and lifeless, the glass cracked and grimy, the front door hung slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. Thomas pushed the door open and stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. The furniture was covered in sheets, the walls lined with faded portraits of people long dead. As he explored, he began to notice strange things, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere deep within the house, the sound of footsteps on the floor above him, the feeling of being watched. He told himself it was just the wind, or the settling of the old house, but the unease in his chest grew with every passing moment. That night, Thomas decided to stay in the house. He had brought a sleeping bag and a lantern, and he set up camp in the parlor, the only room that seemed relatively intact. As he lay there in the darkness, the wind howling outside and the house creaking around him, he heard it. The whispers. The Whispering Hollow. The town of Black Hollow was a place forgotten by time. Nestled deep within a dense forest, it was a town that didn't appear on any modern maps. The few who knew of its existence spoke of it in hushed tones as if the very name carried a curse. The townsfolk were reclusive, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes hollow as though they hadn't slept in years. They rarely ventured beyond the tree line, and outsiders were neither welcomed nor tolerated. Those who stumbled upon Black Hollow by accident often left with stories of strange whispers in the wind, of shadows that moved when no one was there, and of a pervasive sense of dread that clung to them long after they had fled. It was into this town that Eleanor Crane arrived on a cold, gray afternoon. She was a journalist, though not a particularly successful one. Her career had been a series of dead ends and missed opportunities, and she had come to Black Hollow in search of a story, any story that might salvage her reputation. The town's eerie reputation had reached her ears through a series of cryptic letters sent to her by an anonymous source. The letters spoke of disappearances, of strange rituals, and of a darkness that lurked beneath the surface of the town. Intrigued and desperate, Eleanor had decided to investigate. The moment she stepped out of her car, she felt it, the oppressive weight of the town's silence. The air was thick and heavy, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. The few townsfolk she passed on the dirt road stared at her with vacant eyes, their expressions unreadable. No one greeted her. No one even acknowledged her presence. It was as if she were a ghost, invisible and insignificant. Eleanor checked into the only inn in town, a decrepit building with peeling paint and a sagging roof. The innkeeper, a gaunt man with sunken eyes, handed her a key without a word and pointed her toward the stairs. Her room was small and sparsely furnished, with a single window that looked out over the forest. The bed creaked ominously when she sat on it, and the air smelled of mildew and decay. That night, Eleanor lay awake, listening to the sounds of the forest. The wind howled through the trees, and the branches tapped against her window like skeletal fingers. She told herself it was just the wind, but the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It was as if something was out there trying to get in. When she finally fell asleep, her dreams were filled with shadows. She saw herself walking through the forest, the trees closing in around her. The whispers began softly at first, barely audible, but they grew louder and more insistent with every step she took. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a warning. She woke with a start, her heart pounding, the whispers still echoing in her ears. The next morning, Eleanor decided to explore the town. She visited the general store, the post office, and the town hall, but no one would speak to her. The townsfolk averted their eyes and hurried away whenever she approached. Frustrated, she returned to the inn and spent the rest of the day poring over the letters she had received. There was one phrase that stood out to her, repeated over and over again: "Beware the Hollow Man." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest was swallowed by darkness, Eleanor heard a knock at her door. She opened it to find a young boy standing there, no more than 10 years old. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice trembling. "He's coming." Before Eleanor could respond, the boy turned and fled down the hallway, disappearing into the shadows. She stood there for a moment, her heart racing, then stepped out into the hall. The inn was silent, the only sound the creaking of the floorboards beneath her feet. She followed the direction the boy had gone, but there was no sign of him. As she turned to go back to her room, she heard it, the whispers. They were faint at first, barely audible, but they grew louder as she stood there, frozen in place. The words were indistinct, a jumble of voices speaking over one another, but there was an urgency to them, a desperation that sent a chill down her spine. Eleanor retreated to her room and locked the door behind her. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. The boy's warning echoed in her mind. He's coming. Who was he? The Hollow Man. And what did he want with her? The whispers continued throughout the night, growing louder and more insistent. Eleanor tried to block them out, but they seeped into her mind, filling her thoughts with a sense of dread. She felt as though she were being watched, as though something was lurking just beyond the edge of her vision. When she finally fell asleep, her dreams were filled with shadowy figures and the sound of distant screams. The next morning, Eleanor decided to visit the town cemetery. It was an old, overgrown place, with crumbling headstones and gnarled trees that seemed to twist and writhe as though in pain. She wandered among the graves, reading the names and dates, most of which were so weathered they were barely legible. As she walked, she noticed something strange. The graves were all arranged in a spiral pattern, with a single unmarked stone at the center. Eleanor approached the center stone and knelt beside it. The ground around it was bare, as though nothing had ever grown there. She reached out to touch the stone, but as her fingers brushed against it, she felt a sudden, intense cold. The whispers returned louder than ever, and she heard a voice, a single, clear voice, speak her name. She stumbled back, her heart pounding, and looked around. The cemetery was empty, but she felt as though she were being watched. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and she realized they were coming from the ground beneath her feet. She turned and ran, the whispers following her all the way back to the inn. That night, Eleanor decided to leave Black Hollow. She packed her bags and went downstairs to check out, but the innkeeper was nowhere to be found. The lobby was empty. The only sound the ticking of an old clock on the wall. She called out, but there was no response. As she turned to leave, she heard the whispers again, louder and more insistent than ever. They seemed to be coming from all around her, filling the air with their cacophony. She covered her ears and ran out the door, but the whispers followed her, growing louder with every step. She reached her car and fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking so badly she could barely get them in the ignition. The engine sputtered to life, and she sped down the dirt road, the whispers still echoing in her ears. She didn't look back. As she drove, the forest seemed to close in around her, the trees pressing closer and closer to the road. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and she realized they were no longer just in her head. They were coming from the forest itself. The trees seemed to be whispering to her, their voices filled with a desperate urgency. She rounded a bend in the road and saw something standing in the middle of the path, a figure, tall and thin, with long spindly limbs and a face that was nothing but a featureless void. It was the Hollow Man. Eleanor slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The car skidded off the road and crashed into a tree. The impact knocked her unconscious, and when she woke, she was no longer in the car. She was in the forest, surrounded by trees that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices that filled her mind with a sense of overwhelming dread. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey her. She was rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to scream. The Hollow Man emerged from the shadows, his form shifting and twisting as though he were made of smoke. He reached out a hand, and Eleanor felt a cold, numbing sensation spread through her body. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and she realized they were coming from him. As the Hollow Man drew closer, Eleanor felt her consciousness slipping away. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was his face, a void, empty and endless, filled with the whispers of countless voices. When she woke, she was back in her room at the inn. The sun was shining through the window, and the forest was silent. For a moment, she thought it had all been a dream, but then she noticed the dirt on her hands and the leaves in her hair. She looked in the mirror and saw that her eyes were hollow, her face pale and drawn. The whispers were still there, faint but persistent, a constant reminder of what had happened. Eleanor never left Black Hollow. She tried, but every time she reached the edge of the forest, she found herself back at the inn, as though the town itself was refusing to let her go. The whispers followed her wherever she went, growing louder and more insistent with each passing day. Eventually, she stopped trying to leave. She became just like the other townsfolk, pale, hollow-eyed, and silent. She would sit by the window of her room, staring out at the forest, listening to the whispers that never stopped, and sometimes late at night, she would hear a knock at her door. When she opened it, there would be no one there, just the sound of the wind, and the faint, distant whispers of the Hollow Man, calling her name. The Forgotten Road. The sun had already dipped below the horizon when James found himself on a lonely, forgotten road, miles away from the main highway. His GPS had failed him, stuck in a loading loop with no signal. The road was nothing but cracked asphalt, the edges crumbling into dirt and weeds. Gnarled trees loomed over it, their twisted branches reaching for the sky like skeletal hands. His fuel gauge was dipping into the red, and the last sign of civilization had been nearly an hour ago. Every instinct told him to turn around. But where would he go? The road stretched endlessly in either direction, the dark swallowing everything behind him. His headlights pierced the gloom, illuminating the winding path ahead. Then he saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. He hit the brakes, tires screeching as he came to a stop. The figure was motionless, hunched over, draped in tattered clothing that swayed in the breeze. Its face was obscured by long, matted hair. James hesitated before rolling down the window slightly. "Hey, do you need help?" he called, his voice shaky. The figure remained still. A cold dread seeped into James's bones. Something was off. He shifted the car into reverse, deciding he'd rather risk finding another way than interact with whatever this was. But as he looked in his rearview mirror, his stomach clenched in horror. More figures had emerged from the darkness behind him, dozens of them, silent, unmoving, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. His breathing turned shallow as he slammed the car into drive and swerved around the figure in front of him. His tires skidded on the rough pavement as he sped forward, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He didn't dare look in his mirrors. He just drove. The road twisted and turned, the trees forming an oppressive tunnel. His dashboard flickered, the radio crackling with static. A whisper slithered through the speakers, barely audible but unmistakable. Turn back, turn back, turn back. His heart pounded. He reached for the dial, but the whispering only grew louder. Then, laughter, hollow, wheezing laughter that seemed to come from inside the car. He glanced at the passenger seat. Empty. The laughter stopped. The road seemed endless, stretching into infinity. No matter how long he drove, he never reached an intersection or a recognizable landmark. It was as if the world outside this road had ceased to exist. Then, his headlights flickered, and for a fraction of a second he saw something in the beam. A face, inches from his windshield, eyes hollow, mouth stretched into a gaping, unnatural grin. He screamed and jerked the wheel, sending the car fishtailing. He barely managed to regain control before slamming into a tree. Sweat dripped down his face. He had to get off this road. Then, in the distance, he saw it. An old gas station, its neon sign buzzing weakly. Relief flooded through him. He pressed the accelerator, desperate to reach it. As he pulled into the lot, he noticed the station was abandoned. The glass windows were covered in grime. The fuel pumps rusted and broken. Still, it was something. He stepped out, his legs shaky. The air was thick, suffocating. He peered inside the station, cupping his hands against the glass. Shelves stood empty, dust coating everything like a shroud. Then, movement, a figure shifting in the darkness. He stumbled back as the door creaked open on its own. A voice, hoarse and raspy, drifted from the shadows. "You're not supposed to be here." James turned to run back to his car, but his car was gone. The lot was empty. His breath caught in his throat. He spun around wildly. The gas station, the trees, the road, all of it was wrong. The world around him seemed distorted, like a photograph melting in a fire. Then, the figures emerged again. They moved closer, their steps silent. Their faces were blank voids, shifting and writhing like a mirage. He stumbled backward into the gas station, slamming the door shut. The glass warped as they pressed against it, their mouths stretching open wider and wider. A static hum filled the air. The radio on the counter crackled to life. "Turn back." James backed away, his chest heaving. There was nowhere to go. The figures were inside now, standing in the aisles, peering at him from behind shelves. The lights flickered, their shadows stretching impossibly long. A hand gripped his shoulder, cold, clammy. He turned. Darkness swallowed him whole, and then he was back in his car, driving. The road stretched endlessly ahead. His fuel gauge was dipping into the red.